No, it wasn't even that. It was Captain Marvel usually rescuing stupid kids from getting into stupid problems.
A girl who lost her horse. I remember that.
I remember the Danny Bonaducci episode where some of the bad kids at school were trying to lure Danny into a life of disobeying his parents. It was never gangsters or anything like that.
No.
Chosen from among all others by the immortal elders Solomon, Hercules, Atlas, Zeus, Achilles, Mercury, Billy Batson and his mentor travel the highways and byways of the land on a never-ending mission to right wrongs, to develop understanding, and to seek justice for all. In time of dire need, young Billy has been granted the power by the immortals to summon awesome forces at the utterance of a single word.
Shazam!
But some people without brains do an awful lot of talking, don't they?
Oh, you should put that speech on tape.
He pulls a knife, you pull a gun. He sends one of yours to the hospital, you send one of his to the morgue. That's the Chicago way.
Hello, Chicago, hello.
Hello.
Hello. Gotta drink to that.
Welcome to Alternate Reality.
Considering I haven't recorded a review for you in a long time.
Well, why not? Yeah, whatever happened to that?
It kind of fell by the wayside. We haven't had any podcasts to attach it to anyway.
Speaking of which, hey folks, Comicbookman here. Welcome back to the Source Podcast, The Alternate Reality. We've been taking a couple of weeks off to get our ducks back in a row and basically me to recharge my batteries. And it's not going to happen in this episode, but I'm going to try to get these episodes down to about a half an hour each. That was the original intention of this episode. Didn't quite work out that way. We did a full hour, which is fine. But I'm going to try to get these shows down to a half an hour because it's just an absolute bear cutting together an hour-long show. And I'd like to get the shows out more often. And to be honest with you, with Shipshape Update and other stuff that I do, there just isn't the time to do an hour-long show on any sort of regular basis for me anymore. So I'm going to try to have future shows cut down to about a half an hour. But anyway, as always, we're coming to you from Alternate Reality, which is located at the intersection of 111th and Kedzie in beautiful downtown Mount Greenwood. Alternate Reality, where all new comics are 15% off every day for everyone. Today I'm being joined by the movie man himself, the one, the only, good old JR. Hi, JR.
Hey, Comic Book Man. It's nice here in the clubhouse today.
Welcome back to the clubhouse. And today we're going to talk about Shazam, the man who is the original
Captain Marvel.
You got it, the original Captain Marvel. Except no substitutes, the big red cheese.
Yes, the guy with the cape that looks like a
doily.
or a tablecloth.
Tablecloth. It looks like a short table. I always thought his cape was weird.
It was a very weird cape.
Not bad weird, just weird. It was different.
Now he has a hoodie.
And we're going to be talking about Shazam in the comics, and Shazam in the theater, and Shazam on TV, and Shazam in a lot of different places. Recently, the Captain Marvel movie and the Shazam movie have both come out. They both hit theaters. There's a certain serendipity to the two of them.
Seems like it.
You'll know this when I tell you it. But this has happened once before. Right now we have two movies in the theaters which are connected to each other, but through a very
strange, tenuous link.
Mm-hmm. We've done this before. In 1980, I think it was, Flash Gordon Popeye, the movies both came out.
Yes.
They both came out about 2 weeks apart from one another, and those are connected to each other in that both of those are King Features Syndicate comic strips.
Correct.
Down to this day. Yeah. Popeye is still owned by the King Features Syndicate, and so is Flash Gordon, along with a bunch of other characters they do. But for that 2 weeks, King Features was like on top of the world.
Yeah, for a brief shining moment.
They did absolutely nothing with it.
No.
But
both films were not exactly on everybody's lips.
Well, both of those movies, and I digress here, both of those movies are odd. Popeye was good, but didn't attract a big audience, but some people still look back on it fondly. Mm-hmm. But it was an odd film in that it was a musical.
A Robert Altman movie.
A Robert Altman movie with Harry Nilsson lyrics, and it was Robin Williams' first big star vehicle thing, and it was done very much in the style of the original E.C. Seeger comic strip.
Seeger with a dose of Fleischer cartoon thrown in there too.
A dose of it, but not a lot.
No.
It was very respectful of the subject matter, which was a big fear a lot of fans had.
Right.
Flash Gordon also came out, and Flash Gordon has become this cult thing. Since then, Dino De Laurentiis and Lorenzo Semple Jr.
Right.
He wrote it. It's loud, it's ugly,
It's colorful.
It's relatively short. I mean, it's got some good actors in it. I mean, Brian Blessed, Timothy Dalton.
They're all.
Ming was Max von Sydow.
Max von Sydow. They're all munching on the scenery. I mean, it is what it is when you think of De Laurentiis and Lorenzo Semple. I mean, you kind of know what you're in for.
Yeah.
That movie's had its champions over the years. Artist Alex Ross has been a champion of it. Seth MacFarlane, of all people, has been a champion of that movie too. So it's lived on because people have sort of gravitated to it. Popeye, not so much. Popeye's a little too esoteric, I think, for people to latch on to.
It's sort of gone through the rabbit hole and come out the other end. Flash Gordon has. It's become this cult thing. And no, the Popeye movie hasn't done that.
No.
And in some circles, you think it would. I mean, being an alternate film, being Nissen, and of course, Robin Williams,
Right.
and how he passed away a couple of years ago, and that was his first big role. That hasn't as much.
But anyway,
I bring that up only because you have Captain Marvel and Shazam, both of whom are tied to each other inexplicably for reasons that have nothing to do with the characters, and has everything to do with what's going on in the outside world.
Right.
And they're both in the theaters within 2 weeks of each other. And like Flash Gordon and Popeye, these are two good films.
Yeah.
Those two, not so much.
Right.
But they have their defenders. And there's elements of both that you can like. But for the most part, they were sort of disappointing.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say so.
But both of these movies are good. But we're going to start off with the comic book side of things with this. And Captain Marvel, the Big Red Cheese, the original Captain Marvel, the one and only, he was first appearing in February of 1940 in Whiz Comics number 2. And on that cover, Captain Marvel is throwing a car against a brick wall.
As he's wont to do.
Well,
as you do when you're the Big Red Cheese.
And coincidentally, in Action Comics number 1, which came out earlier, you have Superman holding a car over his head,
about to hurl it at whatever he's hurling it at,
and he's about to pound it into what looks like the side of a mountain.
Yeah.
But both comics featured in their very first issues depictions of their main characters holding a car over their head and doing something dramatic with them.
Well, let's not forget,
which is just the beginning of the lawsuit.
You're only when Captain Marvel comes onto the scene in 40, you're only 2 years out from Superman being introduced. Superman at that point was I believe the top selling comic month to month.
Yeah.
And I think everyone was trying to emulate that at some point. I think Captain Marvel, when C.C. Beck wanted that first issue on the racks, I'm sure that was a deliberate nod to trying to recreate the success of Superman.
Well, with C.C. Beck and Bill Parker. Beck was the artist, Parker was the writer. They both created Captain Marvel, Shazam, the whole concept together. And of course, the concept is Billy Batson. He's an orphan. He's a newspaper vendor. And late one night, this strange guy tells him to follow him down to the subway tunnel. They get in the magic subway car, which takes them to, later on it would be revealed as decades go by and publishers go by, to the Rock of Eternity, where he walks past the symbols of the 7 deadly sins.
Right.
And the old wizard Shazam gives him his powers, which, when he says the word Shazam, Billy Batson, the kid, turns into Captain Marvel, the adult.
Exactly.
And of course, Shazam stands for Solomon, Hercules, Atlas, Zeus, Achilles, Mercury. Solomon, wisdom; Hercules, strength; Atlas, stamina, I believe it was; Zeus, power. Which is lightning bolts; Achilles, invulnerability; and Mercury, speed, which is essentially all of Superman's powers right. At that point. Right. Because they hadn't rolled in heat vision and super breath and all that other stuff in by that point. The character of Captain Marvel is modeled on Fred McMurray. That's not all out of the ordinary. I mean, Siegel and Schuster, supposedly they modeled Superman on Harold Lloyd, Clark Kent, and Douglas Fairbanks for Superman.
A popular action film star at the time.
Yeah, and Fred McMurray was making some noise for himself in the early 40s.
Well, sure. Fred McMurray had been one of those actors in the 40s who he was actually pretty versatile. He would do things like The Egg and I, which I think was the first of those Ma and Pa Kettle movies. And he also was in Double Indemnity. He could do drama and comedy at the same time. Later go on to be on television in My Three Sons, for those of you that don't know who Fred McMurray is.
If you ever need something to put you to sleep at night, watch any episode of My Three Sons. It's great for that. It'll put you right out.
But it has a catchy theme song, doesn't it?
Oh, God, I hated that theme song. The thing with Captain Marvel was, forget the fact that he's got all of Superman's powers. In the first issue, he's throwing a car against a brick wall, just like Superman did. And he's got a cape, and he's got boots, and he's got a colorful costume. Forget all that. The thing that really ground national periodical publications, which was DC at the time, was the fact that Captain Marvel was way outselling Superman.
Well, he did, yeah, during the war years, for sure. Yeah, he outsold Superman.
By 1941, he was selling 14 million copies of comics. Think about that for a minute. His comic was selling 14 million copies a year. 1.3 million per issue was moving out the door.
That's unbelievable. And when you think of today's market, that is amazing.
Now, the thing that they did was they wrapped a rogues gallery around Captain Marvel, which DC didn't really do. National didn't really do with Superman. Superman was usually fighting either natural disasters or goons.
Right.
Luthor was there, and Mxyzptlk showed up for like one issue.
Early on, right.
I think you had Ultra Humanite for like one issue, but for the most part, it was pretty much natural disasters and goons.
Earth-based threats for Superman, whereas Captain Marvel was very whimsical in his rogues gallery.
Yes. The whole concept was whimsical. You have a young boy turning into an adult. I mean, it's wish fulfillment. And then you can turn back again. The real magic behind Captain Marvel was all you had to do is say Shazam and bam.
You're this powerful person. Yeah, and I'm sure that's what went a long way to selling that comic to 1.3 million copies a month, is that was wish fulfillment for kids.
It's the easiest thing in the world.
Right.
You just say Shazam and bam, jump ahead 20 years because that was part of the great attraction of this character.
One of my favorite comics when I was growing up as a wee lad.
Well, that would have been in the 70s, not the 40s.
Well, even
Grandpa.
Late 60s for me with Captain Marvel, early 70s, and then I kind of graduated on to Superman and Batman and all that sort of thing. But I never thought about it as a little kid, but later on in life, you start to think about what happens to the persona of Billy Batson when he becomes Captain Marvel. It's almost like that persona is somehow... You don't want to think too deep about this stuff, I understand that, but later on I always wondered, well, they never really wrestled with that too much in the comics, but that one persona obviously sort of gets pushed down somewhere within that individual.
Like I said, they wrapped the rogues gallery around Captain Marvel. He had Dr. Savannah, he had Mr. Mind, he had Ibik.
Tawny.
Well, Tawny being a talking tiger was a good guy.
Good guy,
It was his pal. But you also had Black Adam, Aunt Minerva.
Yeah.
You had a bunch of rogues that Superman didn't have. And also what they wound up doing, which Superman would do later on, was they gave him family.
Yes.
There's Captain Marvel Jr., which DC would later imitate as Superboy.
Mary Marvel.
And you had the Lieutenants Marvel, which, when we get to the movie, they all wind up in there, which is amazing.
It really is.
You had all these characters. That's a lot of what got Captain Marvel pushed to the forefront.
Yeah, I think so too.
He probably had a more complete universe in the early 40s than any other character that was
comic
out
at
there.
The time. Sure, I would agree with that. Yeah, they really rounded out the back characters and backstory of Captain Marvel quite a bit.
In 1941, Republic did the Captain Marvel serial. They wanted to do Superman, but they couldn't get the rights to Superman because the Fleischers were doing the Superman cartoons.
Yeah.
So instead, they went to the guy who was selling more copies than Superman, and that was Captain Marvel. And that's how the Captain Marvel serial came out. 15 chapters of fun with Tom Tyler.
It does something that both Superman serials could never really top, and that was the flying sequences. The Superman ones reverted to they did animation. Whenever he would jump out of a window, he'd suddenly turn into a cartoon.
Well, they got around to Superman by 1948. That was Kirk Allen, but that was Sam Katzman that did it, and he was a Poverty Row guy. Just imagine if Superman had been done by Republic.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. Well,
he'd be pitching guys off of roofs,
you look at
machine gunning them down.
That's one of the remarkable things about that Captain Marvel serial is that he's pretty ruthless, and that he literally does throw a bad guy off of a roof and throws a car motor at another guy. But the flying sequences in that are really impressive. Even today, I look at those flying scenes. They used a multitude of different ways of doing it, not only just superimposing him in some scenes, but they use dummies on wires and so forth. But
paper mache models.
A lot of it's really impressive today. I mean, using live street scenes with a dummy going from one side of a building to another one.
I think that was probably the first time a flying superhero was ever depicted was in the Captain Marvel serial.
Most likely.
And they did a really good job of breaking the mold on that.
Yeah, one of my favorite serials.
And then right about that time, Bill Parker, the writer, got drafted into the military. And so, but C.C. Beck didn't, for whatever reason. I think he was a 4F. But he didn't get drafted, but he stayed on as the artist. But they had to bring on other creators to work on the book.
Right.
Because Parker was in the military. And Pete Costazana, who you might remember from Jimmy Olsen in the 60s, he was like the Jimmy Olsen artist in the 60s. That's where he got his start. Mac Rayboy, who was identified with Captain Marvel Jr. That's where Kurt Schaffenberger got his start, and he would continue on with Captain Marvel later in the 70s. But Kurt Schaffenberger came on board too, and that's where a lot of those original creators came on board. Most importantly, though, was Otto Binder. He took over as the writer.
Yeah, and I think that's when Binder came on. That really even cemented the character even more as far as popularity too.
Binder played with all this stuff, I think, more than Parker did. That's about the time they did the Monster Society of Evil serialization, which was also the first time you had a long-form story that ran through multiple issues, but were all connected, that was ever done before. It was like a 15-chapter serial, which they did in the comics, and the reason they did it was because we've got this 15-chapter movie serial.
Exactly.
So let's do something just like that in the comics.
And that's a way to bring readers back month to month instead of self-contained stories. So yeah, Binder really did some amazing things with...
And it was this big epic where you have the entire Marvel family fighting all of their bad guys,
right,
across 15 issues of a comic.
Exactly. Yeah, I really like the Otto Binder stuff a lot.
Anyway, by 1941, DC National Periodical had enough, and they started litigation against Fawcett. The first lawsuit came in 1941, and it dragged on through most of the 40s. Yeah.
Unreal. Well, some things never change, I guess.
Well, the litigation went on for 7 years until 1948. The first ruling went against National Periodical Publications because the judge said that they had been sloppy with Superman's copyright. They didn't steal Superman because they couldn't infringe on your copyright because you didn't copyright the character correctly.
Oh, interesting. Didn't know this.
But DC National Periodical then appealed, and they wound up winning the following year, saying, well, you're right, we were kind of sloppy with our copyright, but they did rip off some of our stories. And they won on that.
Oh, that's almost a technicality. I mean, how many comics weren't ripping off other comics at that point?
Well, they picked out a handful of stories. They said, look, this is just like our story. And I'm sure the first thing they went with was, look, the first issue he's throwing a car against a wall and we got Superman up on this car. I mean, no, they didn't rip off your character, even though they sort of did. Okay, instead, what the judge decided was, yeah, he's picking up the car. Yeah, you rip that off. Yeah, in this one story he does this. Yeah, you rip that off. Okay, and if you can show enough instances of that, then the appeal of the lawsuit went in DC's favor.
Interesting.
That dragged on for another couple of years. By the time you get to the late 40s, early 50s, comic book readership is nowhere near 1.3 million anymore. It falls way off. Most of the comic book superheroes have gone under by this point. And you're getting the rise of EC comics and horror comics and romance comics and westerns. That's taking their place. Funny Animal comics. Before I get past that, let me mention Hoppy the Marvel Bunny, who I'm sure you will see in one of the movies coming up.
You think there'll be a multi-million-dollar Hoppy movie?
I think they'll do something with Hoppy. Okay. And no, but an appearance.
Maybe.
I bet you there'll be some sort of appearance, and a Mr. Tawny appearance too at some point.
Oh, yeah.
But they wound up settling out of court. Fawcett paid National $400,000, and in 1953 they shut down publication.
And that was it for them.
Yeah, the last was number 155, which came out in June of 1953, and the last Captain Marvel Adventures, which was the companion book, like Superman in Action or Batman and Detective, that was number 150. That came out in November of 1953.
Done in 53.
And that was it. After that, you don't have anything happening with Captain Marvel, but what you have going on is Captain Marvel stories were exported over to England during the war years, and there were no more stories coming over. And they were popular over there. So what you wound up having was a publishing company called L.M. Miller and Sons. They got a hold of a writer named Mick Angelo, and he created a thinly disguised version, very thinly disguised version of Captain Marvel and the Marvel family. And they published until 1963. So they had like a 10-year run.
10-year run out of that.
You got a 10-year run. And if you've ever seen any of those, the art style looks just like Captain Marvel. Marvelman was essentially Captain Marvel ripoff. He had a Marvelman Jr., he had a Marvelman family, he had all the same stuff, essentially. But they were original stories, as original as it gets.
Right.
But they're original stories that were done over there.
When does that courtroom drama start? When do we?
That's a whole separate courtroom drama. We're not going to get into. They stopped publishing in 1963. Alan Moore in 1982 picked the character back up in Warrior and redid the character Marvelman.
Yeah.
Over in England, but everybody I think is aware of what he wound up doing with Marvel.
Oh, indeed, yeah.
You know, we're going to take this character and we're going to make him for today's modern audience.
Mm-hmm. And that he did.
The only other appearance you have of anything called Captain Marvel is in the 60s with the android character by MF Enterprises in 1966 during the camp craze.
I wonder why.
During the Batman camp craze. And they did their version of Captain Marvel, who's called Captain Marvel, blonde-haired android in a purple outfit who yells split, not Shazam, split. And parts of his body come off. So if he's running towards the bad guy and the bad guy's ahead of him, he yells split and his arm comes right off and flies across the room and catches the bad guy.
Wow.
And it was different parts of his body. His legs would come off, his arms would come off, his head would come off, his torso would come off. He was an android.
I want to see that movie. When do you get that?
Oh, that'd be great. That'd be aces if they did that. But that lasted for all of a couple of months because there was, in 1966, there was this other company called Marvel Comics, which was picking up ahead of steam. And they said, you know what? Your character's named Marvel in it. We're Marvel Comics. We're taking you to court. And they wound up settling for $4,500. But yeah, Marvel sued him because of the use of the word Marvel. Nobody was doing anything with the original Captain Marvel. He did make one appearance in Lois Lane for one panel. I think it's a street scene where people are walking by and one of them was dressed like Captain Marvel.
And nobody batted an eye?
Went right under everyone's radar. It was Schaffenberger because he was doing Lois Lane by that point.
Yeah.
And he just stuck it in there. In 1972, DC licensed the character from Fawcett. Because Fawcett still existed. They weren't publishing anything, but as a holding company, they still existed.
Yeah.
And so DC bought the licensing rights for Captain Marvel, and they started republishing Captain Marvel, which is when you, I think, came on board with what you were talking about.
Exactly.
And they got a hold of C.C. Beck and Otto Binder, and actually Denny O'Neil, of all people, and E. Nelson Bridwell, and Kurt Schaffenberger, and they were all working on the Captain Marvel book at DC. And they couldn't call him Captain Marvel because by this point Marvel had already had their own Captain Marvel character, so they had to call the book Shazam the original Captain Marvel. You could do that.
You could say that. You had to qualify calling him Captain Marvel.
Yeah, you couldn't call the book Captain Marvel. You had to call the book Shazam. And you could refer to him as Captain Marvel in the book. You didn't have to refer to him as Shazam. You could refer to him as Captain Marvel, but you couldn't put it on the cover. Beck stayed with the book for about 10 issues. Big disputes in terms of the direction the books was going. The whimsical Captain Marvel that you were talking about, that was exactly the same style that he wanted to pick up from where he left off in the 50s, along with Otto Binder. The problem with that style is it wasn't selling.
Oh, sure, the whimsical comic just wasn't in vogue anymore.
So they wanted to update it more. So, Denny O'Neil would write a story where Captain Marvel would meet hippies.
Well, once you hit the 70s, I think the readership had changed too. I mean, in the 40s, it was grade school age and younger, and then comics in the 70s, I think, grew up a little bit.
Well, that company we were talking about, Marvel, they're the ones.
Right.
They grabbed a hold of the readership and they start dragging them along through the years. Yeah. So by the time you get to the early 70s, those little kids and college kids were starting to get into their late teens, early 20s reading this stuff.
Yeah, their taste had changed.
And Talkie Tawny wasn't flipping anybody's switch.
Yeah, that wasn't going to work for them.
Initially, Captain Marvel got a fair amount of sales because, well, he's back.
Right.
And then once they saw what was back, they said, well, we don't care about this.
Yeah.
And so they stopped reading him. And that ran into problems with, like I said, C.C. Beck and Otto Binder, because that's the stuff they were writing. DC wanted them to, I don't want to say toughen up, but at least update the character more.
Yeah, bring him more in line with what's going on.
To make it more realistic, which the character isn't. So you've got this push-pull going on.
Yeah, and then you turn the character into just another superhero. What makes him unique, you kind of drain it out of him.
So Beck left the book around issue 10, and I remember at the time a lot of strum and drung about that. Yeah. C.C. Beck is leaving the book because he's had enough because they're not handling the character right. And of course, DC's attitude was, well, you're not handling the character right because he's not selling.
Exactly.
So what do you do?
So do you think we should cover an iteration of Captain Marvel in the 70s?
Which one?
The live action.
The live action, yes. One of the things that happened in the early 70s was with Captain Marvel back at DC and in publication and out on the racks every month, or every other month. Actually, the book was bi-monthly. But with him back on the racks, people were more interested in Captain Marvel. And Filmation in the early 70s. I'm not sure what the year was. I think it was 74.
74.
They decided that they were going to start doing live action stuff for Saturday mornings because they'd done cartoons for years. The Filmation started with the Superman cartoon and then the Batman cartoon, the Aquaman cartoon.
Right.
But they wanted to breach into live action, and for some reason they decided to pick Captain Marvel.
Captain Marvel.
It was probably a thing where DC was familiar with Filmation was familiar with DC.
Sure, they were already on good terms, probably legally too, so that was just an easy handshake.
So you wound up with Jackson Bostwick.
The first, though,
was the first of
Captain.
two.
Exactly.
First season was him. Second season was, I forget his name, John Davey. And you had Les Tremayne, who was great radio voice and voiceover talent in the 40s, 50s, 60s. He also acted too.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
And I forget who Billy Batson was.
Michael Gray.
That's right.
Gray, who's recently been making rounds at conventions and such.
Yeah, I was reading a thing. He's actually got sort of a cult following.
Yeah.
He does a voiceover on Archer.
Yes,
The cartoons. I think as voiceovers he's doing himself.
Right.
It's like, you're Michael Gray.
Now, the problem with the Captain Marvel TV show was everything that we were talking about a moment ago as trying to bring the character up to date. They stripped away all the whimsical elements of the show.
No, it wasn't even that. It was Captain Marvel usually rescuing stupid kids from getting into stupid problems.
A girl who lost her horse. I remember that.
I remember the Danny Bonaducci episode where some of the bad kids at school were trying to lure Danny into a life of disobeying his parents. It was never gangsters or anything like that.
No.
And so Danny got himself into big trouble when he got trapped against an electrified fence or something.
You also have to remember what was going on with Saturday morning television at that time. That was at the period when it was decided that Saturday morning television should be educational as opposed to...
Yeah. Well, at the end of every episode, Captain Marvel comes out and says, I think Danny learned a valuable lesson today.
But you know what else Captain Marvel gave us? ISIS.
Yes, ISIS came out of that. That was such a success on Saturday mornings, they wanted to give Captain Marvel a companion show. Yeah. And I can understand their mindset. They wanted to do a female character to appeal to the girls in the audience. But instead of going back to DC, they made up ISIS.
Yeah.
And the ISIS that's in DC Comics today is essentially the same one.
Exactly, yeah. The lovely Joanna Cameron.
Yeah, many dads would get up on Saturday mornings and watch ISIS with their daughters or their sons.
As a 14-year-old young man at the time, she helped me get through puberty.
She had two layers. She was sort of like Adam West, Batman. She had two layers of audiences running there.
Pretty much.
For completely different reasons.
Her costume, and I'm using air quotes right now, her costume looked like she was going to play an afternoon of tennis.
Yes. A white tunic and skirt with a black belt and a big black collar around it with an ISIS symbol on it.
Pendant.
And I think she had sandals for boots. The Wonder Woman sandals in the 60s, the strap-up things.
Right.
I think she had those for boots.
I believe you're right. And as a side note, the ISIS pendant, you can see that very pendant being worn by a character on DC's Legends of Tomorrow.
Yeah, because it's the same character.
It's the same character.
And going back to Shazam, the best thing about that show was the one transition scene they shot where you got the kid standing there and the lightning comes down.
Cartoon lightning bolt.
And the lightning came down like it was liquid.
Yeah.
It literally splashed all over him and he transformed into Captain Marvel. That was the best part.
The best moment. Yeah, the rest of it was...
Everything else you could flush.
Flush it. And then when Billy would go into the cartoon world of the elders.
Oh, elders, fleet and strong and wise, appear before my seeking eyes. And then we'd go off into cartoon land.
Yes.
And Billy would be there with the 6 elders that were his namesake. Yeah. Shazam, Atlas, Zeus, Achilles, Mercury. Yeah. Well, I just found out recently Adam West was one of the voices.
Yes.
I never knew that.
Maybe in 1 or 2 episodes, because there was always Lou Scheimer's voice was always the same elder that he talked to. Yeah. But there's a couple of episodes where he talks to a different elder. It's like 2 episodes, but it's Adam West.
Yeah, usually he talked to Solomon.
Right.
And he'd be, Billy!
And that was Lou Scheimer.
Yeah. Billy, sometime today you're going to meet a little boy who's going to disobey his parents. Really? How will I know, elders?
You'll know.
And then you'll have like Mercury in the back. And these are all animated characters. Right. These aren't people. You'll have Mercury in the back. Billy, just be sure to watch out for the dreamsicle. Okay. And then Billy would come out of his drug-induced haze and he'd be sitting there in the Winnebago with Uncle Dudley, who wasn't Uncle Dudley, it was Les Tremayne. But later on in the comics, they retconned him into being Uncle Dudley to explain him. Dudley'd sit there and he'd go, "What did the elders say, Billy?" He said, "Look for the dreamsicle." Well, I have to look for a dreamsicle. Well, and then they go off in their Winnebago.
There's a reason that they're in a Winnebago with a yellow and red lightning bolt on the front. The original concept, when Scheimer was pitching this back and forth, Billy was going to work for station WHIZ, and that was going to be their news vehicle with the symbol on the front, but all that got flushed before the pilot was ever made.
In the very first episode, there is some stuff about that. Yeah, he does work someplace, and he is supposed to be, because Billy's too young to drive.
Right.
He is his driver, and Billy's going around the country, and supposedly getting stories.
It's immediately forgotten.
Yeah.
Immediately forgotten.
Instead, they're just traveling the highways and the byways of the land.
Yes, they are. And if you can catch the crossover episodes with ISIS, I remember as a kid, I thought it was the best when they showed those two flying side by side next to each other.
Smiling at each other.
Now it looks pretty horrendous.
That was John Davey.
Yeah, that was already the second season, right.
First season, like I said, was Jackson Bostwick. They got rid of him for some reason. The second season, when they did ISIS...
Jackson Bostwick supposedly asked for a few shekels more.
Really?
Yes. and Lou is...
We can just get anybody to put this stupid costume on. We don't need you.
Exactly.
I don't think Bostwick had any sort of acting training when they got him. I think they got him because of his look.
I mean, if you were going to pick an actor that looked like the character in the original comics, yeah. I'm sorry, John Davey did not look like Captain Marvel.
No.
He looked like a bouncer, basically. Jackson Bostwick.
Hey, you kid.
At least Jackson Bostwick had some matinee idol looks going for him. He didn't have much in the way of. Well, I won't go there, but he was what he was.
Well, that Filmation series that lasted until like 75, 76.
Yeah, it was 2 seasons.
Until it finally went off the air. Comic book didn't have a much better run. Like I said, the book was bi-monthly. It went 36 issues. They had a run of 100-page super spectaculars in the middle of their run, where they would reprint a lot of classic Fawcett stuff from the 40s and 50s. But the book finally petered out around, what was it, issue 35, I'm sorry, in 1978 when it was canceled. Oddly, the last couple of issues were done by Don Newton and Alan Weiss.
Oh, okay.
Whose style was totally different from Kurt Schaffenberger, C.C. Beck, the cartoony style. I mean, it was ultra realistic and ultra modeled, as in modeling in the face and the musculature and everything. And it was a huge departure for the book, and DC did it because they're trying to hammer the character into some sort of mold that would fit alongside Superman and Batman and the rest of the DC universe.
And for the longest time, the character was outside of that. It seemed to exist outside of that universe with Superman and Batman.
Well, it did. Pre-Crisis, it was on Earth S. They did a JLA, JSA crossover where they went to Earth S, and that's where they established that's where all the Captain Marvel stuff took place. And they did have one issue, I think it was Shazam 16, 17, 18, someone there was a 100-page super spectacular where Lex Luthor winds up crossing over into the Earth S and meets Mr. Mind, and the two of them try to take over the world together.
Of course they do.
Which was interesting because you finally had these two universes crossing over and meeting up with one another, which they did in the JLA book.
Yeah.
Which I think was JLA 136, 137, 138.
Somewhere in there. And then Crisis kind of folded everybody together.
After the book got canceled, and like I said, the last couple issues were Don Newton and Alan Weiss. They had issues after that. It was canceled because of the DC implosion. It was one of the many books that got killed when the implosion happened. They took what was left of the stories and they serialized them in World's Finest. World's Finest was a $1 book at that time, and so they needed stories. So Captain Marvel was in there with the Superman Batman lead feature, and Green Arrow, and Black Canary, and I think Human Target was in there for a while.
For a while, yeah.
But you had Captain Marvel in there, and then eventually he migrated into Adventure Comics when Adventure went digest. But those were all just reprints. There was nothing new there. It was all reprints. And then that was it until Crisis.
Yeah, that's when he came back, was in Crisis.
Yeah, Earth S. All hands on deck, all Earths, everybody.
Of the deal,
DC wasn't going to get rid of it because they had interest in buying the character. They wanted to own the character, but they were licensing him. Crisis happened. After Crisis, he shows up in Legends, which was the John Byrne miniseries. He's part of that, and then he winds up in the Justice League via Legends. And Legends was the vehicle they used to reboot Justice League, and what they rebooted was the funny Justice League that Keith Giffen did. And one of the members of that was Captain Marvel. Along with Batman and Guy Gardner and Blue Beetle and Booster Gold. He was in that Justice League book for a while, and then in the late 80s, Power of Shazam.
Jerry Ordway.
What
a book.
The Jerry Ordway's art style in that looked an awful lot like the Don Newton, Alan Weiss stuff. But it wasn't. But it looked an awful lot like that.
He found a mid-ground, I thought, to bridging that gap between the too realistic style for the character and still the whimsical side of the character.
It was a happy medium between the two.
Yeah, that was perfect.
It had a hardcover graphic novel they did.
Yeah.
And out of that came the regular series.
Yeah, that's what.
They actually did do a reboot of it that Roy Thomas did right after Crisis, which nobody bought. It was Tom Mandrake, I think, did the art on it. Nobody liked it. And so they let it go for a couple of years with him showing up in Justice League. Yeah. And then they picked it up in Power Shazam. And that ran, like I said, until the mid to early 90s. And then finally they canceled that. The next big appearance from him was in Kingdom Come.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
After that. And then not much up until today when they finally did the new comic he's in right now.
They didn't do anything with him in 52?
Trials of Shazam. I take that back. Trials of Shazam. DC has always been trying to find a way to hammer the square peg into the round hole of whimsical Captain Marvel, but, you know, he needs to be serious. In Countdown, that was when they did the Mary Marvel as a dominatrix.
Oh, right.
Where Darkseid came down. Because after Crisis, everybody's on one Earth.
Yeah.
So the Marvel family lives on the same Earth as Superman and Batman and everyone else. He was in Justice Society for a while after Power Shazam, but when they were doing Countdown, Darkseid come in and, you know, destroy the DC universe for the third or fourth time in the course of 4 or 5 years. After that, they did Trials of Shazam, where they tried to reestablish the character. It's a 12-issue miniseries of 12 Trials of Shazam, 12 Trials of Hercules. Right. Captain Marvel Jr. has to become the new Shazam. Shazam wound up taking the old Wizard's place.
Ah, okay.
And the old Wizard, I think he got destroyed along with a big chunk of the Rock of Eternity in 52 or Countdown. I forget which one. Okay. But that was all part of Darkseid's plan. So you got DC totally screwing up the concept.
Yeah, big time. Yeah, I remember looking at the cover of the first issue of that, and my first thought was, this is not my Captain Marvel.
DC just said, we're not going to do anything with the character.
Yeah.
They didn't after that up until the current series.
Well, did the current series come along before the talk of movies, or?
Current series exists because of the movie. There's a couple of characters in the DC stable that Dan DiDio has no use for. One of them is Captain Marvel.
That's a shame.
Which is one of the reasons why he's never done anything with Captain Marvel. He thinks Captain Marvel's basically a stupid character that doesn't work. Of course, you just had a movie come out.
Yeah, that's doing pretty well.
Which brings us to the second part of today's show, which we'll get to right after this. Hey folks, Comicbookman here. Most people don't know this, but I got my start in comics retail on February 20th, 1978, when I became the store manager of the Comic Book Emporium. 16 years later, I opened Alternate Reality on August 20th, 1994. Like Superman's penchant for double L's, it seems the 20th has always been an important part of my life. I respect that heritage, which is why we have a Founders Day sale on the 20th of each month here at the store. Every 20th, stop by and you'll save 20% off all of your purchases all day long, only at Alternate Reality. Okay, and we're back. Now we're going to talk about the Captain Marvel movie Shazam. I shouldn't say Captain Marvel because people will be confused by that other one with the woman. Mm-hmm. We're going to talk about the Shazam movie. There will be spoilers in the next section, so if you haven't seen Shazam, the original Captain Marvel.
Yes.
If you haven't seen it yet.
Should have called the movie that, Shazam, the original Captain Marvel.
Actually, they should. That's what the comic was.
They got in trouble.
You might want to turn this episode off for now if you don't want to hit spoilers, because we're probably going to talk about them. So anyway, Shazam comes out.
Yes. Shazam is out. And Shazam,
how is it, JR?
Shazam is you know what? We have two, like you said, two Captain Marvel movies this year, and I have one clear favorite. And it's Shazam.
Okay.
I prefer the Shazam movie over Captain Marvel. I have no problem with Captain Marvel. It's fine. But Shazam brings everything that I think's been missing, not only from DC's films recently, outside of Wonder Woman. I know a lot of people liked Aquaman. I was not a big fan. But the one thing it brings to the table that a lot of superhero films haven't had in a long, long time, and I'm really going back in my mind now to Chris Reeve's Superman, and that is heart. Shazam brings a lot of heart to the table. It's sort of inherent with the idea of an orphan, but there are warm moments in this movie that you don't get in movies in general, but in superhero films for the most part. Superhero films seem to have a certain pattern that they follow, especially origin stories. We've got to establish the hero, we've got to establish the villain, we've got to establish the magic hoobajoob that they have to find before the bad guy gets it.
Usually they try to cut as many corners as they can by combining the origins.
Exactly.
You know, the Joker made Batman, Batman made the Joker, that sort of thing.
The interesting thing about Shazam is that the film runs a generous 2 hours and 14 minutes, I think, which is a little lengthy. But You don't see the character of Captain Marvel in full regalia until about 45 minutes into the runtime.
That's about how long it took for the Donner Superman.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But that was 40 plus years ago. The audience has changed a little bit, but I think it's perfectly fine. I think you need to develop the character of Billy Batson, the situation that he's in as an orphan, which also lends itself to bringing a lot of heart to the film, and also the wizard and getting him to the wizard and all that sort of thing, and establishing the villain as well. So there's a lot of backstory here, but it all works pretty well. Sometimes these films get a little hung up on their origin stories and they seem like you're going through the motions, but this one doesn't. I think the origin story here works really, really well. And also, this film is also a comedy for the most part. It plays the character not for laughs. The character is a hero. What it does with it, though, is it doesn't have the dual personality. You don't have... Physically, he becomes an adult, but mentally, he's still Billy Batson. He's still a 12-year-old or a 14-year-old kid. And all of the things that come with that. I mean, they've made no hesitation about comparing this film to Big. They emulated the movie, the Tom Hanks movie Big. That's exactly the humor they draw from it.
There's worse directions they could have gone. They could have Snydered it.
It's the perfect... Well, that was a fear when I first heard the project was coming down the pipeline, was they were going to try and shoehorn Captain Marvel into being grim, gritty, and serious.
Which is what I was just talking about with DC. That's essentially what they were trying to do for the last 20 years, is grim and gritty him up.
And you can't do that with Captain Marvel. If you're going to be true to what C.C. Beck and
Parker
wanted to do with the character, was to have the whimsy to it. And while this film isn't overly whimsical, it doesn't shy away from it. There's a post-credit scene with... Well,
there's two post-credit scenes.
Two post-credit scenes, but if you were looking for the whimsy of a Mr. Mind, you get that in spades in the post-credit scene. But the film doesn't shy away from the fun elements of the character. The adult Captain Marvel is played by Zachary Levi, who was Chuck on television for about 5 or so years. And he looks like the way you want the character to look like. He has the matinee idol looks. But he also plays the character as kind of a goofy, self-effacing kid. The kid's never bratty in the film, but he's just a kid trying to work his way through being a sudden adult, and all the things that come with that. Going into a liquor store and buying beer for the first time is one of the gags of the film.
I'd like to purchase some of your finest beer.
Exactly. And the film has a great time with that stuff, but it's never at the cost of the character. It's never looking down on the character or turning him into a laughingstock. The heavy in the film is Savannah, played by Mark Strong, who was also in a little movie called Green Lantern a few years ago.
He played Sinestro in it.
Exactly. So this is his second time as a DC bad guy, and he's actually better here than he was in the Green Lantern film. Savannah doesn't look exactly like the way he did. He's not 4 foot tall.
Actually we were talking about the renditions of Captain Marvel before. Totally skipped over Legends of the Superheroes.
Yes,
Captain Marvel's in there.
Gosh, we forgot about that. Yeah,
Captain Marvel, along with a bunch of other... Captain Marvel basically takes Superman's spot in the Justice League, because they couldn't use Superman because he had a movie in the theaters at the time that came out. Basically, he was out of bounds the same way Superman is on the CW right now. Because we're making movies with him.
Yeah.
Same with Batman today. But Legends of Superheroes had Captain Marvel in it, and Savannah, who's played by Howard Morris.
Yes. Who
did a great turn as Howard Morris.
It is a great turn. Yeah, it's one of the saving graces of that Legends of the Superheroes.
That Legends thing, that is one of those miserable things you'll ever watch in your life. But they knock it out of the park with some of the casting.
Yeah, there's a few.
Some of the casting is right on the nose, and Howard Morris as Savannah is one of them.
Yeah, and as far as the origin of Captain Marvel, it's interesting. When I watched the trailer, I almost wondered, was there going to be an origin story for the character? Because there's nothing about that in the trailers when you watch the trailers for it. And you do get it. And when you find out the wizard is played by Djimon Hounsou, an African-American actor, who I believe he was the lead in Spielberg's film Amistad. But all that's there. You got they don't do the elders or anything, but they do have the statues of the various...
well, in the comics, there were never the elders.
No.
The elders were right on the Filmation thing. For some reason, they didn't want to do the wizard.
In the comics, you had the 7 deadly sins, and that's all here too as well. But it was a little bit striking when I saw that they were going to actually have the wizard Shazam in it, and it was an African-American actor. And I thought, well, that's interesting take on that whole situation. And how Billy gets there is he's on a subway ride, and the subway suddenly turns into this mystical portal type of thing, and he gets there.
Which is essentially all the comics.
Exactly. So it's very reverential to the comics. Performances are all solid. Like I said, Zach Levy is having a great time. Not only is he playing the character as a kid, but also a kid with a big heart who at every turn is trying to help people. There's a sequence in the film. It doesn't involve always rescuing people from dramatic situations. Basically using a little charge of lightning to charge up people's phones as he's walking down the street. The Marvel family is there as well. The people he lives with at the it's more of a
It's a foster home.
Foster home kind of situation.
That has a lot of kids in it.
And they're all of varying types. You have a Mary Marvel. There's a Hispanic kid. There's an Asian American kid. One of the best scenes in the movie for me is all the members of the Marvel family appear to take on the bad guy towards the end of the film. And it's one of those kind of goosebump-raising moments.
Well, what they did was they took the original concept of Lieutenants Marvel, which was basically just 3 nondescript white guys originally, and they broke it up ethnically amongst a Hispanic kid, a black girl, I think.
A black girl, an Asian American girl.
Is one of the characters gay?
It's sort of mentioned sideways. There's nothing made of it.
But but they took Lieutenants Marvel and they broke them down into different ethnic, racial, demographic groups, which I don't have a huge problem with.
No.
I mean, they were all pretty nondescript in the 40s and 50s.
No, and when you talk about the modern concept of a family, that it's all encompassing. No matter what background you come from, you try and create a world family, and that sort of plays into what they're doing with the Marvel family. But that's a great moment in the film. It all plays out really well. If I had to ding it for anything, it runs a little lengthy, particularly in the third act with the fight with Savannah. The post-credit scenes are fun. Mr. Mind is a nice thing to tease for follow-up movies if they're going to do that. During the opening sequence in the origin part, when he's with the wizard, one of the things you see lurking around in the background is a tiger. It never talks. It never does. There's none of that, but it's there.
You probably didn't notice in the movie, Superman Returns. Remember when they did the costume and they did the tight close-ups of the costumes? It was all the little S's around
Yes, it's all little lightning bolts.
His 2 buttons on his cape, that Talkie Tony's face is on both of them.
I did not notice that.
Well, you wouldn't notice it, except I saw a picture of it online where they did a tight close-up of it, and it's Talkie Tony from the comic. It's engraved into the face of the button. It's nothing that stands out. You'd really have to be looking for it in order to find it. The Starfleet uniforms in the J.J. Kelvin timeline, I think they do the same thing with the Starfleet
they
symbols.
have those little symbols.
Yeah, they're all over the uniform and in the patterning of it. You can't tell it by looking at it, but if you get up real close and look, you see it there.
That is really interesting. I did not notice that or even hear about that. It's the first time hearing about it, too.
Yeah, I just saw that the other day on a picture online. It said, bet you didn't know that Talkie Tony was in the movie, and then they show the close-up of the buttons.
This film looks really great, too, and it's on an economical budget. Warner's budget for this thing was $80 million.
That's a really tight budget.
That is a really tight budget.
What's essentially a Superman movie.
And it's got some really interesting flying sequences. There's some shots of Shazam, I'll call him Shazam, flying very close to the ground. Yeah. And the way it's handled, it looks completely realistic, but you usually see characters flying through thousands of feet in the air, but he's very close to the ground in a couple of shots. And how they squeeze this out of $80 million, I don't know. And I guess
maybe they did it the same way they did Jackson Bostwick back in the early 70s.
Strapped
to the front of a car.
No, this is the full body. You're seeing the full body of him flying. 80 million with, I think, another 60 or 70 as far as advertising on it. So, I mean, a lot of people have been saying, it's not doing that well. It's doing well enough. I mean, it's not going to do the money of a Marvel film, but I think it's successful enough for a character that might be considered a little on the obscure side to go ahead and do more of them.
Any idea when they're going to get around to Black Adam? What I heard after this came out was they want to do Black Adam next, and then the follow-up to this film would be the 2 of them fighting.
Well, The Rock chimed in about a week after this film opened and said that, it's still on the boards. We're going to be starting it soon. It's going to happen anytime now. So whether or not that's the case, I mean, The Rock would probably elevate the success of that movie, a Captain Marvel movie, into another level. You've got 2 guys who are pretty playful on screen, Zach Levi and The Rock. If it becomes overkill with the laughs, but we'll see. But I heartily recommend this movie. I loved it a lot.
I think the only problem I can see for this thing right now in the short term is Warner's. They seem to take a long time between movies. I mean, Marvel's on essentially a tight production schedule. We've got this date and this date and this date and this date, and the machine is working behind us to get these films done to get them into theaters at these days.
Disney's up to 3 a year.
And Warner's, it's like, well, we're thinking about it.
It's loosey-goosey. Yeah, they don't seem to have a schedule.
And the problem you've got with that is the Carl problem with Billy.
Yeah.
He ain't going to get any younger. Yeah. He's just going to get older.
Exactly.
And at some point, he's going to age very quickly out of that role. Yeah. And then you're going to have to recast him.
He will age out of that role.
Because the character only works if Billy's a kid.
You could probably, you're going to get away with maybe 5 years tops with a young actor like that before he starts to look too old to play the role.
Freddie Freeman, too.
Yeah, unless it's, fall back on recasting, which is unfortunate, but they need to get that scheduling going. But yeah, for me, out of the 2 Captain Marvel movies this year, this is the one.
Yeah, you can check out JR's review of Shazam on the store's website, myalternatereality.com. Also, while you're there, check out Bo's News, which is updated every day. Check out Vito Carli's reviews. She did Battle Angel Alita.
Yeah.
And everything else we do, including the Shipshape Update, the videos that I do, and much, much more, myalternatereality.com. I thank you for coming in today, JR.
I appreciate it, Comic Book Man. Always fun to talk about the movies and the comics.
And when you get a chance, stop off at the store, Alternate Reality. We're located at the intersection of 111th and Kedzie in beautiful downtown Mount Greenwood. Alternate Reality, where all new comics are always 15% off every day for everyone. Until next time, this is Comic Book Man.
And JR.
Saying, bye! Thanks a lot for listening. If you enjoyed this show, please like and share it with all your friends. We value your feedback, so drop us a question, comment, show idea, or complaint either at arcomics@msn.com or, if provided, in the comments section down below on this platform. The opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of the individuals and not necessarily those of Alternate Reality Incorporated. This show is, as always, coming to you from the Alternate Reality Comic Shop, located in the heart of beautiful downtown Mount Greenwood at the intersection of 111th and Kedzie, serving Chicago comics fandom since 1994.
This concludes the broadcast from World Control.